Jack always believed his little patch of earth was sacred. Nestled between cookie-cutter houses with their manicured lawns and white picket fences, his garden was a green rebellion. Rows of kale, tomatoes, and sunflowers that thrived under his care. It was more than just plants. It was his sanctuary, a place where he felt alive and free from the stifling rules of the neighborhood. For months, Jack poured sweat and patience into that soil, nurturing it like a prized possession. But this morning, everything had changed. Jack stepped out onto his porch with his usual morning coffee, expecting the familiar sight of his flourishing crops basking in the dawn sun. Instead, he froze. A tall steel fence now stood where the garden had been, its cold bars blocking his view and cutting off his access. The metal gleamed ominously, casting long shadows across the yard. No gate, no sign, just an unyielding wall. His heart pounded. The fence was new, impossibly so. There hadn't been a hint of construction yesterday. Who had put it there? Why? And how? Jack hurried down the steps, eyes scanning for any clue. There were no footprints, no tools left behind, not even a note. Just that towering barrier standing like a silent, accusing sentinel. He tried the fence, but it was locked tight. The first wave of anger hit him hard. How dare the HOA do this without telling him? His garden was on his property, his hard-earned space. Surely they couldn't just fence him off without permission. But as he stomped back toward the house, his anger cuddled into unease. The fence wasn't just a petty act, it was a message. He grabbed his phone and dialed the HOA office. The line rang and then clicked into voicemail. "This is the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. We are currently unavailable." He called again. No answer. Frustrated, Jack decided to walk over to the clubhouse, the meeting place where the HOA board held their secretive gatherings. Maybe he could catch someone and demand answers in person. The neighborhood was unusually quiet as Jack crossed the manicured streets. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, but said nothing. When he reached the clubhouse, the windows were shut tight, blinds drawn, as if hiding something. The sense of isolation wrapped around Jack like a cold fog. Suddenly, a low hum broke the silence. The soft drone of machinery, or was it something else? Jack's heart skipped. Was someone still working on the fence? Was this a prelude to more changes he didn't know about? His mind raced. This wasn't just about a fence. Something bigger was happening here. The fence wasn't just cutting off his crops. It was cutting him off from his freedom, from his connection to the land. Jack clenched his fists. He would find out who was behind this, and he wouldn't let them get away with it. But as he turned to leave, a shadow moved inside the clubhouse, a figure watching him through the blinds. The game had begun. That night, the neighborhood lay quiet under a blanket of stars, the usual hum of distant traffic replaced by an eerie stillness. But Jack couldn't sleep. The fence was more than just a barrier. It was a provocation, a challenge thrown in his face. Who had the authority to cut off his crops without a word? And what were they planning next? Unable to shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface, Jack decided to investigate. He waited until the clock struck midnight, then slid quietly from his house. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching like silent watchers as he crept toward the HOA clubhouse. The building stood dark and brooding, its windows reflecting the faint moonlight. Jack pressed himself against the side wall, careful to stay hidden behind a thick hedge. He could just make out voices, low and urgent, coming from inside. He strained to listen. "I'm telling you, this crop nonsense has to end," a sharp voice hissed. "It's ruining the neighborhood's image. The board agrees. We need a permanent solution." Another voice, softer but no less firm, replied, "We've warned him. The fence was the first step. But if he pushes back, we have other ways to make him comply." Jack's pulse quickened. Other ways, he whispered to himself. Yes, the first voice said, "Let's just say we have friends who can make things uncomfortable." Jack's stomach twisted. Was this just about the garden? Or was the HOA involved in something darker? He pressed closer to the hedge, risking discovery. "Listen," the softer voice continued. "If this gets out, it'll ruin us. We need to be careful. No leaks." Jack's mind raced. These weren't neighbors arguing over rules. They were conspirators planning something. But what? Why such secrecy? And who were these friends? A sudden creak behind him made Jack freeze. The hairs on his neck stood up as he heard footsteps crunching on gravel. He pressed himself flat, barely daring to breathe. A flashlight beam swept past, inches from where he hid. Probably just a raccoon, a voice muttered. Jack's heart pounded as the footsteps faded away. He waited several long minutes before daring to move again, backing silently toward his home. But the night had planted a seed of dread deep inside him. This wasn't going to be a simple fight over a fence. The HOA was playing a dangerous game, and Jack was now a target. Back in his room, Jack stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over. He realized he needed a plan, not just to get his crops back, but to expose whatever power lurked behind the HOA's polished facade. He knew one thing for sure. If the HOA thought they could intimidate him into silence, they had another thing coming. Tomorrow, the battle would begin. The next morning, Jack awoke with a restless energy pulsing through his veins. The clandestine conversation he had overheard lingered in his mind like a warning. That HOA wasn't just a meddlesome group enforcing rules. They were orchestrating something much darker, and his garden was caught in the crossfire. Determined not to back down, Jack packed a small bag with tools, gloves, and his phone. He planned to confront the HOA board in person, armed with facts, photos of his crops, and the law on his side. Surely, reason would win. Surely. As Jack stepped onto the freshly paved sidewalk leading to the clubhouse, he noticed something odd. His toolbox was missing. Panic clenched his chest. He remembered leaving it right beside his back door last night. It had vanished overnight. Sabotage, Jack whispered bitterly. He scanned the street. No sign of his tools, no footprints, no clues. Someone didn't want him fighting back. His heart raced. The fence was just the beginning. Inside the clubhouse, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee. The board members sat around a large oval table, faces illuminated by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Mrs. Grayson, the HOA president, caught sight of Jack and raised a sharply arched eyebrow. Well, Jack, she said coolly. To what do we owe the pleasure? Jack forced calm into his voice. I want the fence down. It's on my property. I've done nothing wrong. Mrs. Grayson smiled thinly. Rules are rules, Jack. You knew the restrictions when you moved in. Your garden is an eyesore. The community standards must be maintained. Jack slammed a folder of photos onto the table. This is my livelihood. These crops are valuable, and I have every right. The room tensed. One board member whispered something to another. Jack noticed the cold, calculating looks they exchanged. It was clear they weren't just dismissing him. They were watching, waiting. Suddenly, the lights flickered and dimmed. A power surge or a deliberate cut? Jack didn't know. What he did know was that something felt off, like the clubhouse itself was a trap. When the lights returned, Jack's worst fear materialized. His gardening gloves, hidden in his bag, were missing. In fact, everything he brought to defend himself had been subtly taken or sabotaged. As if sensing his panic, Mrs. Grayson leaned forward. You see, Jack, you're outmatched. This community operates on trust, and you've broken it. If you keep pushing, you might find yourself facing consequences far worse than offense. Jack's mind whirled. What consequences? What were they capable of? And how far would they go to keep him silent? He left the meeting with more questions than answers, feeling a knot of fear tightening in his chest. His garden wasn't just threatened, his entire place in the neighborhood was under siege. That night, as Jack sat beside his fenced-off crops, he knew he needed a new plan. The HOA wasn't just a bureaucratic nuisance. They were an enemy, and he would need to fight fire with fire. Jack's tiny apartment smelled faintly of honey and beeswax, a constant reminder of his secret hobby. For months, hidden from the neighborhood's judgmental eyes, he'd nurtured a small hive behind the garage, a fragile colony of honeybees that buzzed softly, pollinating wildflowers and quietly thriving. Now, as the walls of the HOA's cage tightened around his crops, the bees whispered to him like allies in the dark. They were small, but fierce and fiercely loyal to their keeper. Sitting at his worn kitchen table, Jack sketched his plan. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, he'd respond with a sting. The target, the HOA clubhouse. Its polished roof gleamed arrogantly above the manicured lawns, a symbol of their power and control. What better place for a swarm of his bees to make a statement? But this wasn't just a prank. Jack's plan had to be precise. He needed to move the bees without harming them, without risking stings to innocent neighbors, but loud enough to send a message. His crops, his freedom, weren't theirs to fence off. He gathered his beekeeper suit, smoker, and hive boxes with practiced hands. The night was thick with fog, wrapping the neighborhood in a soft, muffling blanket. Perfect cover. Jack crept to the hive. The bees hummed restlessly, sensing the change. With calm and steady motions, he carefully opened the hive, gently brushing the bees into a specially prepared box. The queen was safely inside. Without her, the hive would collapse. Heart pounding, Jack strapped the box to his back and slipped silently through the shadows toward the clubhouse. Every creak of a branch, every distant bark of a dog sent adrenaline rushing through his veins. Reaching the roof ladder, Jack climbed carefully, mindful of his weight and balance. At the top, the HOA's emblem shone in the moonlight, proud, unyielding. This was his moment. He positioned the hive box in the far corner of the roof, propped open the entrance, and lit the smoker to calm the bees. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped back. Within minutes, the first bees began to emerge, filling the air with their low, buzzing chorus. Jack felt a thrill of both fear and triumph. This was no longer just a fight over crops. It was a battle for respect, for autonomy, a clash between control and freedom. But as Jack slipped away from the clubhouse, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed nearby. A flashlight beam cut through the fog, hunting through the darkness. Jack froze, heart hammering. Was he caught? The beam swung closer, then passed. Whoever it was, they hadn't seen him. But Jack knew the risk was far from over. The bees were now loose on HOA territory, and the next 24 hours would tell if his plan was genius or disaster. As he vanished into the night, Jack couldn't help but wonder, how far was he willing to go to take back what was his? The sun had barely risen when the first screams shattered the usual calm of Oakwood Hills. Jack sat quietly in his apartment, listening to the distant chaos unfolding around the neighborhood, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and dread. He had barely made it back from the clubhouse roof before the bees began their takeover. Neighbors stumbled outside, swatting wildly at the buzzing clouds that swarmed near the HOA clubhouse. Cars screeched to a halt as terrified drivers jumped out, their faces pale as the bees chased them back indoors. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed and trembling. Jack knew the bees weren't aggressive by nature. His careful care ensured they rarely stung unless provoked. But thousands of bees suddenly swarming on a public building. It was a nightmare for anyone unprepared. From his window, Jack spotted the HOA board members rushing around, donning thick gloves and wielding insecticides, trying desperately to contain the chaos. Mrs. Grayson barked orders like a general under siege, her face flushed with fury and panic. Jack's phone buzzed nonstop, texts from neighbors, calls from reporters, even messages from friends urging him to stop. But Jack held firm. This was the consequence of their actions. The fence, the sabotage, the silent war against his crops. Now the HOA was facing a reckoning. A sudden knock at his door jolted Jack. He peeked through the peephole to see a woman holding a microphone and a camera crew. The local news had arrived. "Jack Evans?" the reporter asked as soon as he opened the door. "Yes," Jack replied cautiously. "We want your side of the story. The neighborhood's buzzing, literally. What's your response to the bee swarm at the HOA clubhouse?" Jack took a deep breath. "They fenced off my crops without warning. I tried to talk to them, but they ignored me, even sabotaged my tools. This bee swarm, it's a message. If they think they can silence me, they're wrong." The camera crew filmed as Jack showed them pictures of his thriving garden and the fence. The story quickly went viral. Meanwhile, Back at the clubhouse, the board scrambled to contain the bees. The exterminators arrived, but their sprays only seemed to agitate the swarm further. In a desperate move, the HOA called in a specialist beekeeper to relocate the hive safely. Jack watched the turmoil from afar, knowing the HOA was losing more than just control of the roof. They were losing face. But the situation was far from resolved. That afternoon, a neighbor approached Jack cautiously. "Some of us think you're right," she whispered. "The HOA's been pushing out gardeners for months. They want to control everything. Maybe it's time the neighborhood stood up for its green spaces." Jack nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. He wasn't alone. As evening fell, Jack received an unexpected text from Mrs. Grayson herself. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk." The game was changing, but Jack knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down now. The next morning, Oakwood Hills was a neighborhood transformed. The usual quiet hum of lawnmowers and sprinklers had been replaced by whispered conversations and furtive glances. Jack's daring swarm stunt had ignited something far bigger than he'd imagined. As Jack stepped outside, neighbors greeted him with a mix of curiosity, admiration, and caution. Some nodded in quiet solidarity, while others still eyed him as troublemaker. The local news had descended, their cameras capturing every heated conversation and wary smile. The HOA clubhouse remained off limits, its roof still home to the displaced bees and the tangled aftermath of Jack's plan. Inside the clubhouse, the HOA board was in full crisis mode. Mrs. Grayson paced the polished floor, flanked by anxious members. The public backlash was mounting, and their control over the neighborhood's narrative was slipping. "We have to contain this," Mrs. Grayson hissed. "If word gets out about the board's true motives, we're finished." "What do you want us to do?" one member asked nervously. "The community is turning against us." Mrs. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Find out who's been leaking information to the press, and keep an eye on Jack. He's more dangerous than we thought." Meanwhile, Jack met with a small group of neighbors in his backyard. Gardeners, hobbyists, even a few homeowners tired of the HOA's iron grip. They shared stories of petty fines, harsh restrictions, and secret meetings designed to squeeze out anyone who didn't conform. "We need to organize," one woman said. "If we stand together, the HOA can't ignore us." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was no longer just about his crops. It was about reclaiming their neighborhood from fear and control. As the day wore on, Jack noticed unusual activity near his property. Strange cars parked across the street, unfamiliar faces watching from a distance. The HOA was clearly retaliating, but how far would they go? That evening, Jack's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. "Meet me at the park. Come alone. Anonymous." Curiosity and caution warred within him, but Jack knew he had to follow this lead. Whoever had sent the message might hold the key to the truth behind the fence and the board's real intentions. Under the dim glow of the park's lampposts, Jack waited. Minutes passed, stretching into silence. Just as he was about to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows. "You don't know the half of it," the voice whispered urgently. "The fence wasn't about rules. Some on the board are profiting from empty lots. They want the neighborhood to fail, to buy properties cheap and flip them for big money." Jack's breath caught. This was bigger than he'd imagined. Greed, corruption, a secret scheme buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. The stranger handed Jack a folder thick with documents, leases, emails, bank transfers. "Proof. Be careful," the figure warned. "They'll stop at nothing." As the stranger disappeared into the night, Jack felt a new fire burning inside him. The fight for his crops had uncovered a corrupt empire, and now it was his mission to bring it down. Jack sat at his kitchen table, the folder of evidence spread before him like a map of betrayal. The documents revealed a dark undercurrent running through the Oakwood Hills HOA. Board members secretly colluding with developers to devalue properties, forcing homeowners out so those lots could be snapped up and flipped for profit. His fence wasn't a petty rule. It was a tool in a larger, ruthless scheme. His phone buzzed. A message from the anonymous informant. Meet me at the cafe. Noon. Bring nothing. Jack knew the stakes were higher now. Exposing corruption in this tight-knit community could make enemies, but silence was no longer an option. At the bustling neighborhood cafe, Jack scanned the room. A figure waved discreetly from a corner booth. He slid in. "I have more for you," the informant whispered, sliding a USB drive across the table. "This has emails, recorded meetings, even wire transfers. Proof that the board planned this all along." Jack's pulse quickened. "Why help me?" The informant glanced nervously toward the door. "I'm on the inside. I want it out, but they're watching me. You're their biggest threat now." Jack nodded. "What's our next move?" "We need to get this to the authorities, but quietly. If the board suspects, they'll cover their tracks." Back at home, Jack prepared his case meticulously. Photos of the fence, videos of the swarm, the documents, everything meticulously organized. He reached out to a trusted local journalist known for exposing corruption. Days passed with a tense calm. Then, just as the story was about to break, Jack noticed unusual activity. His tires slashed, anonymous threats left on his doorstep, and strange cars tailing him. The HOA's warning had become real. One night, as Jack returned from a meeting with neighborhood allies, headlights flooded his driveway. A sleek black SUV blocked his path. The window rolled down slowly to reveal Mrs. Grayson's cold, unreadable eyes. "Jack," she said softly, "you don't want to do this. Think about what you're risking." Jack's voice was steady, but inside, adrenaline surged. "I'm not afraid of the truth." Mrs. Grayson's lips curled into a warning smile. "You'll regret this, for all our sakes." The SUV sped off, leaving Jack staring into the night, resolve hardening like steel. The next morning, the expose hit the front pages. Headlines screamed about HOA corruption, abuse of power, and the mysterious bee rebellion that sparked a community uprising. The neighborhood buzzed with shock and anger. Board members were called to answer for their actions. The community meetings turned into battlegrounds of truth and justice. Jack became an unexpected hero, not just for his garden, but for standing up against greed and control. Yet, even as the dust settled, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Someone was still out there, watching, waiting. The fallout from the exposures swept through Oakwood Hills like a storm. The HOA board was under intense scrutiny. Investigations launched, and several members resigned in disgrace. Mrs. Grayson disappeared from public view, her name dragged through headlines as the mastermind behind the corruption. For Jack, the victory was bittersweet. The fence was gone, his crops were safe, and the bees thrived back in their quiet corner of his property. Yet, the scars of betrayal ran deep, not just in the neighborhood, but in the fragile trust between neighbors. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. New leadership was elected, neighbors united around shared gardens, and restrictions eased. Oakwood Hills was changing, becoming a place where green thumbs could grow freely and voices mattered. One afternoon, Jack received an unexpected visitor. A man in a crisp suit introduced himself as an investigator from a state environmental agency. He carried a folder and a small, sealed envelope. "We've been watching the situation," the man said, his tone serious but respectful. "Your bees and your garden sparked more than just a neighborhood dispute. They've highlighted important issues about land use, community rights, and sustainable living." Jack listened carefully as the man explained the agency's plan to grant Jack's property a special designation, a protected pollinator habitat. This status would provide legal protection for his crops and bees, shielding them from future HOA interference. Jack felt a surge of hope. His quiet rebellion had blossomed into something bigger, a movement that could change laws and protect communities everywhere. But as the man turned to leave, he slipped the sealed envelope into Jack's hand. "Open this when you're alone," he said, then disappeared down the street. Curiosity gnawed at Jack all evening. Finally, under the soft glow of his porch light, he broke the seal. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy image showing a shadowy figure near the HOA clubhouse the night Jack released the bees. Written on the back, in careful handwriting, was a single line. Not everyone on the board was against you. Some of us were waiting for the right moment. Jack's mind reeled. Had an alley been hiding in plain sight all along? The story wasn't over. The neighborhood secret still whispered in the wind, and Jack knew he had more battles ahead, not just for his crops, but for the future of Oakwood Hills. He smiled, feeling the steady hum of his bees nearby, a reminder that even the smallest creatures could change the world. The fence might have been torn down, but the fight for freedom, community, and respect was only just beginning.